Whether they're on our phones or sat-nav, on our computers or in books, maps form a key part of our day-to-day lives. They're a rich, wonderful resource, and today I'm going to make a case for why you should bring them right to the heart of your genealogy research. Maps are useful as well as beautiful. They can illuminate the lives of our ancestors as well as the places they lived. They can show us new record sets to search in, and they can form a sound foundation for critical thinking in our work. Today, I'm going to show you why you should use maps and also show you how. I'll be sharing some top tips for genealogical mapping, and I'll also be highlighting some archival resources which will really enhance the stories that you're telling. I love using maps in my genealogy research, and I'm sure you will too. They're a rich, vibrant resource. So let's get started. Why use maps? Let's take a moment to consider how they fit in with your genealogy research process. So much of our research involves names, dates and places written down in words, whether from the census, parish registers, civil registration certificates or other records. But if we're to make proper sense of this information, we need context. We need to set those individuals into the social and geographical setting in which they lived. This is where maps come in. They make our research more visual and give us extra information about our ancestors' surroundings, key factors in advancing our family history. Maps contribute to logical reasoning and the spotting of patterns and errors. Every time you uncover a new document which might relate to your ancestor, you ask, do I have the right person? Does this fit with the story so far? Mapping genealogical addresses can provide an extra point of comparison to determine if a record match is a valid one. Once we consider the backdrop for our ancestors' lives, we can start to understand the motivations behind the choices they made. Maps give you a sharper focus, a richer story. Where and when records were created has a big influence on where they're archived. Maps can help you locate records, and the details of buildings and places in your ancestors' locality can provide ideas for other record sets to search. Maps can also show how local topography shaped our ancestors' lives. We'll come back to this one later. The approaches I'm going to show you can be adapted to family history of almost any time period, but we'll focus mostly on 19th and 20th century examples, periods for which we have a range of address-rich sources available. How can I use maps? Let's take a look at a really useful mapping technique called the outlier method. This is a strategy in which a series of historic addresses or locations is collectively identified on a map of the relevant settlement in order to see the characteristic network of the individuals concerned. A settlement could be a town, village or city, but what do we mean by a characteristic network? Take a moment now to think about your own life. You'll have a residential address where you live, and possibly an occupational address where you work. These addresses may have changed over time, and you may also spend time at the homes of close friends or family members. Taken together, these all form your characteristic network, a web of places which form the basis of your life. A complete stranger knowing only your characteristic network could understand a lot about your life and habits. With the outlier method, you're going to be that stranger, and your ancestor is the one whose network you're going to study. Visualizing your data in this way allows you to identify any strange-looking outliers that are a little bit different from the rest of the data. Now let's recap the main steps involved in the outlier method. First, select an ancestor you've researched. Ideally, you'll need at least a few data points for their residential or occupational addresses over time. This is a great opportunity to revisit your work and check through it. Knowledge of a person's occupation is really valuable in this process, so also note down these details for your ancestor. Those of you with Nottinghamshire ancestry may know that the county was a flourishing hub of the textile industry in the 18th and 19th centuries. Lace workers and framework knitters were particularly numerous, a group of whom are shown in this photograph taken around 1900. Next, make a list of addresses for your person of interest. Typically, you'll find a lot of address details in the census and in the birth, marriage and death certificates of civil registration. Other sources include wills and probate records, death duty registers, and even newspaper articles if your ancestor ended up hitting the headlines. Then acquire a suitable map. We'll take a closer look at this during our top tips, but a great source of UK maps for the 19th and 20th centuries is the website of the National Library of Scotland. Its substantial collection of digitised Ordnance Survey maps are free to browse and download. There are many other map collections available online and in archives too. I'll highlight these later. Two of the main considerations are the scale of your map and the era it was made. You'll need the map to be at a suitable scale for you to see the details of the streets and buildings. The Ordnance Survey 25-inch to the mile series is often a good choice. Once you have a map and have plotted an ancestral network, you'll see patterns emerge. One common pattern of points in the outlier method is that of clusters around groups of streets. This is particularly common in working class families who were dependent upon short-term rentals, who may have moved around several times in a few years, sometimes even from house to house along the same street. You may also see linear migration. There can be an occupational reason for this, so finding out more about the family's jobs and workplaces is a good avenue to explore. Sometimes no pattern is immediately apparent, or the points could have quite an asymmetric distribution. More research into the individual's friends and wider family may be needed to understand what's happening. Alternatively, you could have two or more namesakes confused with each other and are actually visualising more than one person's network at once. As its name would suggest, one of the strengths of the outlier method is in spotting unusual data points. An outlier is any point which doesn't seem to fit in with the rest of the network, such as the point marked in black here. Outliers can indicate mistaken identity in your research, so if you see one, you should always go back and check you do have your ancestor and not a namesake. It is also possible that the outlier is genuinely your ancestor, but that there's a part of their story which you have yet to uncover. Try searching a broader range of record sets to deepen your knowledge of the person's narrative. Some key points then. Occupations are one of the biggest influences on the characteristic network. Nottinghamshire has a rich history of textile manufacturing, particularly lace and hosiery, some of which are shown in the images to the right. Expect to see framework knitters, lace makers, bleachers and dyers, alongside other industries like brewing and tanning. Learn more about these occupations in tandem with your map work, and you'll gain a deeper understanding of your ancestors' network and motivations. Expect to see a range of patterns in your ancestral networks. You may see movement within a city or between cities over time. If this happens, use a larger scale map alongside the smaller scale ones to understand the bigger picture. Obvious outliers can be a case of mistaken identity, or they could be highlighting an interesting story to follow up. Now let's see the outlier method in action through a fictional example set in Old and New Basford. Imagine we have a family of textile workers whom we've tracked over the 1870s and 1880s. The census and the birth and death certificates of several of the children have provided a lot of addresses, which we've plotted on a contemporary Ordnance Survey map. The family's addresses form two very obvious groups. In the northwest corner, we have the blue cluster in Old Basford, where the family moved in a fairly linear fashion over a period of time. Later on, they relocated to New Basford and moved between several rented residences in a close network of streets, shown in red. Local history is important here. Old and New Basford were active centres of industry with jobs in lace making, framework knitting, bleaching and soap making. The family's move from Old to New Basford may have been prompted by jobs in the silk or hosiery industry. You can see from this zoomed-in view of New Basford just how many textile factories it had during this period. Consider whether this hypothesis matches up with occupational evidence from your research. Exploring the textile-related record collections at Nottinghamshire Archives might illuminate local context. We do have one unusual point, shown in black, which doesn't fit with the others. Revisiting the documentary evidence might help you to determine if it's a case of mistaken identity, or part of this family's wider network of extended relations or friends. We might seek out information about the local history of New Basford and of the family's occupational history to see if we could find a reason for this outlier. It might also be useful to locate this address on consecutive censuses and look through neighbouring properties to see whether other branches of the family perhaps lived in this part of town. Hopefully this has shown how useful the outlier method can be for enhancing your understanding of family history, of checking your work and finding new directions to explore. Now let's cover some top tips for using maps. Tip 1. Use a contemporary map. Take any location and many maps will have been made of it over time as the area changed and developed. These two maps of Nottingham city centre were produced 134 years apart. Some features are recognisably similar on both maps, such as the marketplace and the shape of surrounding roads in the northwest corner. However, the later map has a much higher density of buildings. If we compare the speed map to a 1915 Ordnance Survey some 300 years later, the differences are considerable. We can only gain useful insights from a map if it's representative of how that place looked at the time our ancestor was there. Finding an appropriate map may require a bit of hunting, but is well worth doing. You might not find a map that matches to the exact year, but try to get as close as possible. If you were researching a family in West Bridgford in the 1880s, you wouldn't use the 1950s map, where the area is much more developed. Back in 1883, there were more open fields and countryside. Using a contemporary map helps you to get good matches to street names and a realistic sense of the surrounding environment. So, where might you find a suitable contemporary map? We've already mentioned the free Ordnance Survey maps at the National Library of Scotland. These cover most of the UK and allow you to download maps as a PDF. Local archives are a real unsung hero on this score. Not all items have been digitised, but most local archives have a good collection of county and town maps from different eras, some dating back as far as the late medieval period. Explore archival catalogues online and work out what might be worth consulting. The map shown here is from the digital collection of Nottinghamshire Archives and depicts the county in 1610, part of a famous series of maps by John Speed. It's great for understanding county boundaries and the physical geography of the region. The British Library holds around 4.5 million maps, and their website includes a range of guides to help you understand how to access and use their collections. Old Maps Online is another good resource to explore. Tip 2. Street names and numbering can change over time. When you're working with historic addresses, be aware that house numbers and street names may have changed, whether through peacetime development or housing loss during the Blitz. Street indexes can help you to navigate an area as it was in yesteryear. Utility companies often produce their own street plans, some even including names of occupiers, and some survive today in local archives. For example, Nottinghamshire Archives holds an 1860s street index produced by the Worksop Gas Company. Insurance companies also compiled indexes and street plans, many of which are held at the British Library and the Guildhall Library. Building plan registers, part of civic planning and detailing the addition of buildings to a street, can be useful in working out how street numbering has evolved over time. consider using maps in conjunction with trade and area directories. Local archives generally have reference copies, such as the Kellys and White series of directories. These list key personages and businesses in a town or county. The images shown here are from White's directory in 1832, which is available on the Internet Archive and can be found by running a search for Nottinghamshire directory. On the left is an excerpt capturing the place of residence of key local figures in Baysford that year. Tip 3. Observe local topography. Topography describes the physical geography of the landscape. Features such as rivers, lakes and mountains have a strong influence on where people choose to live and work. When you're working on your family history and carrying out genealogical mapping, try to consider the local topography alongside occupational information. Imagine that you have a boatman and his family living in Burton Joyce in the 1860s, who seem to vanish from the town in later years. Potential matches for them turn up in East Bridgford and Neaton, but you're unsure if it's them. In terms of topography, Burton Joyce lies on the banks of the Trent, and if you look closely at the top right photograph of Burton Joyce, taken at a later point in time, you can see the river passing close by. The River Trent snaking through the map is a feature linking all three settlements and would be a considerable influence on the life of a boatman. It is therefore plausible that the matches you found for the family in later years are correct. Larger scale maps, for example the Inch to the Mile Ordnance Survey series, may prove more practical for exploring families with possible migration and long-distance matches. Remember that there are many different types of map. In contrast to the others we've seen in this presentation, these enclosure maps of Radcliffe-on-Trent and North Collingham date back to the late 18th century and show who held rights over particular pieces of land. As with our other examples, these maps might provide contextual insights and point you towards useful record sets for your genealogy research. So make the most of what archives have to offer. And if you're working with census records, then use a street map alongside your research. Always use a contemporary map. Involve the local topography when you're analysing possible record matches, and be alert to changes in street names and numbering over time. Of course, there are so many other types of map and mapping technique which you can use in your genealogy research, too many to name them all here. But I hope I've been able to persuade you how much maps can enhance and support your family history work. I also hope you're feeling inspired to explore the collections at your local and regional archives, and hopefully, as soon as we're all able to do so again safely, to get out to the archives and see these documents face to face. And remember this, maps help us navigate. Bring them to the heart of your genealogy research and you'll be amazed at the stories they can bring to light. So good luck and have fun.